So welcome. Today we will be doing a hands-on session, and this is with use of an autoencoder. So in the last few lectures you have understood and studied about autoencoders, and previous to that there was multilayer perceptron, and the whole idea was that these autoencoders can be used for two purposes. One of them is to do a very efficient representation learning, and the other one is to actually understand about how to use these representations as initializations for your multilayer perceptron. So today's example which we will be doing is a PyTorch based tutorial, and this is on something which is well known, and this is called as the MNIST classification challenge. So as we had done on the lectures, I did say about that one of the earliest areas where this whole aspect of deep learning was coming out and working out pretty good was actually in the aspect of using these kind of classifiers for classifying handwritten digits into 0 to 9, and that is how they were working out fine. So today's example which we will be doing is use the standard data set called as MNIST, and use this small patch kind of images for your handwritten digits which are of size 28 cross 28, and then we will be using them for classification purpose. So let us get started with it. So as with any of our codes, we have the initial part which is a header structure of importing down all the libraries which we would be subsequently needing for our work. So here it does not need much of an introduction over there as such. So except for one interesting package which comes down over here, which is called as the optim package. So we are a bit ahead of time in terms of introducing optim on your programming paradigms, but keep in mind one thing, that we will be making use of a standard gradient descent itself, although it's from a stochastic gradient descent with batch size of 1. So this is just to make get you introduced to the advanced options available within the library and packages. Now as one important aspect which I need to really point out is that down the line we will be discussing much more details about optimizers and all aspects of this package called as optim, but for the sake of time and to keep it conformal to our subsequent lectures, we are already introducing it over here. And then this also makes your coding quite compact without having to do, because if you remember from your earlier one on multilayer perceptron where you had your gradient descent coming in. So the gradient descent, the major issue was that you had to put down a lot of lines of code in order to find out your error, then do a derivative of the cost function, do a derivative of the network, and then update all the parameters over there. Whereas here these are all just into one single library, and as we keep on going through it, I will be introducing you to further concepts over there. So let's run this first part of the header block. Now once that works out, the next part is to load your data. So this data is again available within your Torch Vision datasets itself. So you don't need to download something from an external web resource file and repack it in any ways. So the first part is that it goes on. So the codex option over here is just to do a decoding over here. So it will come down eventually. So let's go to this download part over there. So since it's already downloaded for me and available to me, so I did not see any other command coming down. But if you're doing it for the first time, you would definitely be seeing some downloader commands that downloading from so and so location, and what you get down is something called as a U byte or unsigned byte type of data file. Now it's not much of a concern to be worried about the data file, because your codec function over here can actually read from those available direct kind of files. So the first part over here is we have a few of these tensors which are few of these functions which are more of related to how to handle down the data and get the data into your Torch tensors, or as and when required even into your NumPy arrays subsequently. So here the first part of it is just a small function written down to fetch down one integer at a time, or one image basically at any point of time. So what it does is basically there is a codec to read down, and it reads in hexadecimal format and gives you back an integer from every single hex code which is written down onto the file. So typically how it's stored is that you have 0 to 255 or 8 bytes available over there, 8 bits available over there. So these 8 bits, instead of so when you are storing it down, you can have some sort of a binary representation and everything. So the U byte basically uses a hexadecimal number representation for storing these 8 bits over there. Now as it goes down with the this hexadecimal representation form over there, you need to decode this hexadecimal representation and get an integer equivalent representation in 8 bits, and that's the purpose of this get int, which is to convert down from a hexadecimal representation to a integer space representation. Next is here this parse byte functions whole option is that you get down the whole file in terms of a string, whereas this is a matrix, and you will have to size the whole string which comes down into 2D matrix over there. So that's the part of this parse byte function. And next is when you would be reading down the image file over there. So you need to give down your path name over there, and this path name for the file is something which is given down in data path, which we will subsequently be using. So over here, once you give down the data path over there, it reads out the data. Then it gets what is the length of the data, the number of rows, number of columns, and these comes down from the data header structure in itself. So once you go down into say Torch Vision and get into the data sets, you will be getting more and more details of how this whole data is packed over there, and this is quite simple. So the MNIST raw format is what we are using over here in its way. So that function gets initialized. The next part is to read down the labels as well, and with each of these images, the labels are also associated with another U byte file, and you will have to again parse and get down your single byte level representations, so that you know whether this image corresponds to 0 or corresponds to 1, 2, 3 up to 9. So that makes it a 10 class classification problem. So once that's done, so the next part is you actually execute all of this. The first part is that I need to get down my training images and my training labels, and for that I will be reading down my image file as well as my label file, and for each of them the data path for my training is my train images U byte file, and for my training labels it my training labels U byte file, and for my test images they are 10,000 images which are available in your test, and you have labels corresponding to each of these 10,000 images. So for your training you have 60,000 images, for your testing you have 10,000 images. So let's run this one and you will be able to so it would take a bit of time because of this file IO operation going down. So once this file IO operation is over, then what we would be doing is we come over here in this part where the purpose is to print down the size of your training images and labels and test images and labels. The only purpose we keep on doing it in this way is to see what is the nature of the tensor and whether the number of samples in training images and labels is the same, and within your testing images and labels is also the same. So you get down your training samples, which are 60,000 such samples, and now what happens is that each is an image of 28 cross 28 pixels, as we had already discussed. So 28 cross 28 will map down to 784 neurons, linear neurons which you have. So then you get down your linear neurons coming down over here. So you know that your training size is 60,000 samples cross 784 dimensional feature space, if you would like to put it down onto a pixel wise feature space. So similarly your size of the test images is so there are 10,000 samples for your testing, and there are 784 pixels on your test part over there. So doing that we get into the next part. Here the purpose is basically to try to display it out. So what we do is we take the first image over there and then map it down onto a 28 cross 28 form using this view function within Torch, which is quite interesting because so what it can do is as in if you had used MATLAB for your resize or Python for your reshape operators, where you can convert one kind of a matrix to another kind of a matrix, say a row matrix or a column matrix into a row cross column, a 2D matrix over there. So we are using the same kind of a function in order to convert my linear matrix available over here into a 2D matrix, and then just typecast it to NumPy so that I can use my pyplot IMShow in order to look into. So as you see, this is clearly a number 0 which you see over here. Now I can change this and say make this as 2, and then run this one. So the second image which I have over here is something which looks like this, and then that's something like number 4. So basically you can just play around with them and then plot down a few of these images as well. Now I can look into my test image as well. So I can just go over here and then make that change into image equal to test image, and so this is my test image. So the second test image is basically the number 1 as it comes down. So for us as humans it's much easier to understand, but the whole point is that can we make machines actually be that intuitive to understand these using neural networks as well. So here goes another of our commonly known option, which was to have down if CUDA is available, then just find out whether there is a GPU, so that we can use this flag of use GPU in our subsequent works as well. So here comes the first part, and which is about defining your network. So remember that we were speaking about an autoencoder as such. So an autoencoder is basically where you have an input, you have a hidden layer, and then you have an output, and the size of the output is the same as size of the input. And technically what you are trying to do is you are going to map this input to become so whatever is the output, that has to be similar to the as close as possible to the input itself, and that brings us pretty much into the paradigm of what is called as a regression problem, where your loss or your cost function over there has to be something in the order of, say, an L2 norm, L1 norm, or L2 norm, or an MSE, a mean squared error. So if that error over there is 0, it means that all values are mapped and it's on a continuous space. So here what we try to do is basically we try to represent a linear, a fully connected network from 784. So that's 28 cross 28. Now those get mapped onto 100 hidden neurons over there. Okay, that's the first hidden layer, and the transformation applied over here is a ReLU, or a rectified linear unit, to go down. So the other part of the network, so this typically this part of the network which brings down from the image input to my representation space is what is called as an encoder unit. Okay. Now the other part of it, which is my decoder unit, which goes down from this representation space, the latent representation space, onto my reconstructed space, which is called as a decoder. So you remember these clearly from our last slides as well. So that's where it converts from 100 neurons to 28 cross 28, and then the objective is that within the forward function, whatever is the input, that will be going through one forward transformation through the encoder, and then a forward transformation through the decoder itself, and then you have your autoencoder form. And now if your GPU exists, then you can convert it, otherwise you can just leave that for your CPU options over there. And the next part is that we would try to get down these weights for our own usage in a bit later on stage down the code. So this is using this function called as deep copy. So what it does is that it basically copies down all the weights available at this point of time. So what I would like to show you a bit later on is that while we are training, you would be seeing down the change in weights coming down. Okay, so let's run this function and then do it. So once the autoencoder is defined, because I was printing my network over here, so this is what the autoencoder looks like. So you have a linear unit which or fully connected neurons which connect from 784 to 100, and then on the decoder you have from 100 to 784. So here is where we start by defining the criterion function or the loss function. So for me the loss function is an MSE loss, and the optimizer, so I said that we will be making use of another new thing which is called as an optimizer. So this optimizer helps me in reducing down the bulk of codes which we would be using, but details I would be covering down in a bit later on lectures down the week. So as of now, what you can remember is that this optimizer is basically one simple way of computing your whole gradient and doing the backpropagation in one single go. Okay. Now for the first part is to train down the autoencoder, or where we are going to do down the representation learning part over there. Okay. So I had set it down for 3 for convenience, but say let's make it as 10. So we will train down this autoencoder for 10 epochs over there, and we will take a batch size of 1000 images. So that means that what will happen is that you have total 60,000 images for your training, and I can break it down into 60 different sets of 1000 images each. So after 1000 image, I am going to calculate my error and then update my network parameters over there, and within each epoch this will happen 60 times basically. Okay. Now what I would run is one iterator or the for loop over the range of epochs. So my epochs is basically 10 epochs over there, and then within each epoch what I am going to do is pull down my inputs, and once the inputs are available I would be converting them onto a GPU array if my GPU is available. Once that is done, so you remember that we had a model dot 0 grad, or which was making all the gradients within the model as 0. So here it becomes as optimizer dot 0 grad, and my so my output was the forward pass over my network. Then my loss was coming from my criterion function, and then I had to find out my derivative of the loss, which is my backward. Now the next part is where I had w of n plus 1 is equal to w of n minus eta times of del w of j at w of n. So that is what is solved down by this optimizer dot step function over there. Once that is done, so this is whole update rule or back propagation is what is solved over here. Then we can get down our running loss calculated down, and then eventually print down per epoch what is the loss coming down. So let's run this part, and you would see it running down. So you see that it trains over 10 iterations as we had done. So iteration is basically one epoch which we are using down over there, and this is what's plotting down the mean square error, because that's the loss over which we are calculating it. You can see it's steadily decreasing. It starts where somewhere around 0.08 and then comes down to 0.022, and there is a steady decline as well. So this is not a, we don't know whether it has actually stopped or not, but this was just to show you that how much it can actually go down. Next is to check down your autoencoder performances. So let's look into your what was it trying to reconstruct over there. So let's give down one image over here. So what we have done over here is that we take one of these test images. So just any one of these test images coming down to over here. Now if the test image is coming to us and a GPU is available, then we just convert that over here onto my CUDA compatible form, and then from there make it into a 784, or because it was a 28 cross 28 image which was coming to me, so I just converted it to 784 dimensional input, and then that is fed forward through my network, and then I am again back converting it as my output image. Now the whole point over here is that I will try to display them as standard grayscale images, and that's what I do using these two parts of my function over there. Now they are pretty straightforward to go through, and I am not going into much of a details. Now if you look into here, you would see that you see somewhat the shape and structure of this number 2 as preserved, which comes down over here, though there are some noisy patches as well. So possibly if you train over a longer number of epochs, you will be seeing down these errors going down to a significant extent as well. So the next part is that we try to run down some sort of a visualization in terms of what weights it had learned. So these were basically the sort of weight matrix which was there before we started the training over there, and then this is sort of the weight matrix which looks into after your training. So these are basically small square matrices of 28 cross 28, and you have 100 of such available. So this axis basically makes it 280, this axis is 280, and these are small square patches of each of them plotted down. Now what we try to see is what is the difference of these two weights, and that is what. So these are the pixels, or these are the weight locations which actually got updated during training, and you see that a significant number of them have been updated, and that's a training part which goes on. So this is for simple visualization, but there are more detailed explanation which were there in the theory part, and we have a few of them in the next of the theory part, and these are more intuitive for your understanding and how to get more of them running. So once that is done, the next part is to get into using an autoencoder for multilayer perceptron based classification. So here what I would be doing is that I no more need my whole autoencoding part over there. So my decoder block can be detached, and I can place down a multilayer perceptron in order to just classify. So here for my multilayer perceptron, I just need 10 layers which will correspond to my outputs over there for each of these 10 classes. So I get my input I convert it to 100 latent variables, and from there I bring it down to 10 different classes, and then it has to be one hot as per my definition. So what I do over here is a very simple part, which is so we take down the first part of my network, which is my encoder, and from there I just add on an extra part, which is my classifier, or just a mapping from 100 to 10 neurons over there, and finally have a transfer function which is no more a ReLU but a log softmax over there. And then the option is basically, if everything is available on a GPU, then to convert that, and then use down my copied weights from this earlier trained part. So these were my weights on the encoder part of it, so I just copy them down over there and then use those weights in order to initialize my initial part over there. Now once that is done, so let's execute this part. So you can see the network looks something like this, that I have a 784 neurons connected to down to 100 neurons, and with a ReLU transfer function, and then 100 neurons to 10 neurons with a log softmax transfer function. Okay. Then on this one I also defined down my loss, but this loss is quite different. This is a negative log likelihood loss or a classification loss, not exactly mean square error loss. So a bit down the line, when we are doing cost functions later on, I will be introducing you to what is the form of a negative log likelihood loss. Or to keep it much more simpler, what you can understand is that in case of a mean square error, you would see down differences in terms of so in a mean square error, you are basically trying to minimize the Euclidean norm between your input and output over here. Now for a classification, when it's just a one hot vector, you know that one of them is supposed to be high and everything else is going to be 0. So these kind of ones where one of them is high and everything else has a 0 probability, you can use some sort of information theoretic loss, and those kind of losses are one of those kind of losses basically a negative log likelihood loss. So I define my optimizer as well over there, and then get into my classifier. So here say I just decide to run it down for 3 epochs. Okay. So I can use my initialized weights and then get into over here. Now if you typically look over here, we were also calculating out what is the accuracy of prediction, and you see that while the loss is going down, your accuracy is also quite increasing over there. And then we come down to visualizing these weights basically. So these were the weights of this encoder before they were finally used for the classification part over there, or end-to-end update of the whole network, and these were the ones after this update happened, and this is the amount of changes which are there on each of them. So that does bring into the fact that while we are doing a fine tuning of the whole multilayer perceptron using our initialized versions of weights from the autoencoder, it does significantly impact some of these weights. If you had trained this say the feature layer or feature encoding layer for a longer amount of epochs, and over here also for a longer amount of maybe this would go down actually, because we haven't yet seen a convergence on the encoder. So for my typical experiences on this data set was that run it down for 100 epochs, it would go out pretty fine, but then we would run out of time if we are trying to do that on this lab class itself. Okay. So here we try to visualize down the weights for the training for the classification part over there. So these were the initially random weights which were alerted to the classification network, which is from 100 to 10 neurons over there, and this is what you see down for the after the training, and then this is the amount of updates which just went on. So this is one basic sketchpad of how to do it with the MNIST. So in the next class I will be getting you introduced onto 2 different forms of autoencoder training. So one of them was where we have a ladder wise training, or one network at a time, and the other one is where you have a bunch of hidden layers and you train it as an encoder decoder network in one single stretch, and then use these initialization in order for your MLP feature extraction or the initial layers over there. But there will be using another higher order data set, and that's called as the fashion MNIST. So that's also a grayscale image available and is of the order of MNIST data set itself, except for that there are no more handwritten digits or binary like images present over there, but these are perfect grayscale ones where you have intensities varying from 0 to 255 over a good linear span as well, and these are images of clothes. So 10 different classes of apparel and small 28 cross 28 snapshots of each of them, and 60,000 for training and 10,000 for testing. So subsequent to that, we will also be doing on color images with something called as a ALL IDB dataset, and then so that would also perfectly work out. And subsequent to that, so these are all patch-wise classifications, and eventually in the last autoencoder lab, we will be doing down pixel to pixel classification as well. So with that, it works out quite good. And thank you, and stay tuned for the next lecture.